Hi everyone, welcome back to my author channel. What I'm going to speak about today is whether you should outline your story or whether you should just write from the seat of your pants. So as we call ourselves pantsers, yes, pantsers. I'm a pantser. So, but she says, pausing dramatically, excuse me. So when I first started writing, when I first started getting my stories out onto the page, it was actually my husband who really got the fire lit underneath me, because ever since I was a kid, I've had a crazy, wild imagination, and I never understood where it came from, but I loved it. You know, I lived in comic books. I was raised on comic books. So in my country, in South Africa, we only got television in our country when I was 7. So before that, once a week, we would go to the drive-in. Oh, do you remember the drive-ins? I loved going for drive-ins. You know, you would get home after school. You would sometimes have supper. Sometimes we would take supper with us, or we'd buy hot dogs there. But I'd have my bath. I'd get into my PJs, and then off we'd go in the family car, and we'd sit and we'd watch movies. And if we could stay away, because it was usually on a Friday night, we'd watch the second movie as well. And you'd buy hot dogs and junk, and it was just such a wonderful experience. But oh my goodness, did it stir my imagination. And then I was raised on comic books, on superhero comic books. That was my favorite. I used to read like Richie Rich and, you know, other like comics like that, Archie and things, but they didn't really appeal to me. I was obsessed with superhero comics, and I wanted to be a superhero when I grew up. I mean, that was it. It was just like, dang, that is like the life that I want, okay? But the point that I'm making is that my imagination really believed that it was possible at such a young age. So growing up to the age of 7, which is like those really years where you just learn how, you know, who you are, and you become who you are, and you learn from your parents and you learn from the world. It was such an important part of my life, because I devoured books. So I could read at the age of 3. You know, I started school when I was 5 years old. Back in the day, you could start that early, that young. And so by the time I was 5 years old in school, I could read like perfectly, you know, and I was always ahead of all my classmates. But I devoured every book I could get my hand on. Then when I was 8 years old, I saw the first Star Wars movie. Oh my goodness. Okay, so that is where my love of fantasy and sci-fi and becoming a fantasy and sci-fi writer, started when I saw my first Star Wars movie combined with the comics and oh my goodness. Okay, so when I started writing, naturally, I went into fantasy and sci-fi, and I wasn't really into, like, you know, studying other authors and their process and things like that. I just wanted to get my story out on the page. That was it. And so I just launched into my epic fantasy series, The Sword Bearers. I'm going to put it up here next to me. So when I originally wrote the entire story as 4 really thick tomes of like 700 pages each. It was crazy. And I self-published them. And then in 2016, I decided I was going to, actually, no, it was a little bit later. It was actually during COVID. 2016, I think I had just finished publishing the last book. And then it was during COVID, when we had nothing to do but sit at home. I decided I was going to break each of those 4 books. Each of those books had 3 parts. So I decided to create a separate book out of each part, which meant expanding it a little. But I also had a lot of revision to do, I realized, when I started rereading the story. So I realized that as an epic fantasy author, I desperately needed to do an outline, because it is an enormous story. So right here next to me, you can see I've only got 6 books. There are another 6 coming. Okay, so I get to the end of the story. Okay, so 12 books, shorter books. All my links for my purchase links, by the way, are in the description box, and my social media. If you're interested in fantasy, and they've got 5-star reviews as well. If you're interested in that, it's in the description. So I realized that before I'd started, I desperately needed to have done an outline, going from beginning to end and how the story panned out. And I knew I had an idea of where it started, what happened in the middle, and then how it ended. I had a very clear vision and understanding of that. But as I was rereading and rewriting each book, I realized that there were continuity errors, because it's enormous and it happens over quite a few years, the story. And that is when outlining is vital. So if you're writing a series, for example, I personally would suggest that you do an outline. Okay. But when it comes to my standalone novels, okay, I'll put the next post up here. You can see them at the top. My standalone novels, my short story and my 3 standalones, I literally wrote them as a pantser, because I knew exactly how the stories were going to start, what happened in the middle, and how they ended. So my first draft was me just like full on purge. Okay, I encourage you to go and watch my video on is writing an art form, because I speak about how important it is to get your first draft out without worrying about how good the writing is, or whether it's edited beautifully or it has style. Like, you just leave that nonsense for when you start doing the editing process, okay, and the revisions. When you write your first draft, you've got to write, it's got to just come out of you like you're giving birth to it. It's got to purge onto the page. So I loved, and that is the way I write. I'm a very intuitive writer. So I pay attention to my imagination. I pay attention to what is coming up, and then my story expands as I go. And sometimes I'm about halfway through the story, something happens, and then I go back to like near the beginning, because I want to add something that is like a foreshadowing, for example, that is going to come in later into the book. So that is how I write. So I might like go back a little bit and then add something in the beginning, but I will continue writing until I get to the end of the book. Then when I start getting into those revisions and things like that, that's when I start working through the book step by step. And even then, because I do a lot of rewrites and then, edits and things like that, and then I pick up things like mistakes, or I've repeated myself somewhere. So that is where you put in the work. Okay, but that first draft is very important. That is just my process. I prefer my standalone novels writing as a pantser, that if ever I write a series again, I have to do an outline, because I have a Gemini brain. So I'm a Gemini, right? So I can keep a lot of things compartmentalized in my brain while I'm going, but I'm still a human being. So I'm going to forget stuff, or I'm going to repeat myself somewhere. So it is very important that when you have a very long, involved story, that you have your whiteboard up, as it were. I just use notebooks. Okay, I've got notebooks everywhere, typical writer. So I've got my notebooks, but I've also got my, a very clear picture of exactly what I need to do, and how and when, and how the characters interact, and if I must put a character earlier or later, or move them further down the story, or whatever that is. But it's very, very important that I have a very clear, big picture, because that's what outlining does. It actually gives you the big picture, where you sit back and you look from beginning to end, and everything that happens in between, step by step. All right. So whether you feel like you need to do outlining, or whether you are a pantser, both have merit. And exactly like I said, my brain loves the process of organization with outline for a big story. But personally, when I'm writing a standalone, I have to be a pantser, because then I write from intuition purely. Okay, I write from my imagination. Whatever comes up, I write from emotion. It's a very emotional process for me as well. So I personally would love to hear from you guys, from you. What, are you a pantser, or do you pantser? It's difficult saying that word. Or do you like outlining? Do you like to compartmentalize? Do you like to see things like, put it on a big whiteboard and have your cards, and having the process, because both are extremely beneficial. I never do the outline. If I had to write a series, I would never do the outline. This sounds weird. I would never do the outline initially. I would first write this whole story. So if it's 3 books, for example, like a trilogy, I'd write all 3 books, and then I'd go from the beginning, starting with book 1, and then I would do my outline, and then make sure this is what happens in book 1 from beginning to end. This is what happens in book 2 from beginning to end. All the characters involved, the timelines. I'll give you an example. In the Sword Bearers, in my epic fantasy series, I had to fix seasons like summer, winter, autumn, winter, like summer, spring. So like the main character and her family in book 1 are traveling from the north of the planet. They're us, okay? They move north, then they pass through the central part of the planet, and then they end up in the south. So I made a mistake where, and it was when I fixed it right in the beginning, then it fixed like the rest of it. The main character's birth, it's called birthing day in my epic fantasy series. She has her birthing day in winter, in midwinter, and then because she's in the southern hemisphere, her birthday is in, say it with me, summer. Okay, so can you see? So so it's summer. Remember, it's summer. So when she's having her birthday in later in the book, or in book 2 and 3, and they're in the southern hemisphere of the planet, her birthday's in summer. So so I had to be like really careful. So I had to fix that. And that's just one example if you're writing a huge story that takes place over a hectic amount of time. So let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It's literally free. It's not going to cost you anything. Hit that like button. It just helps my videos get seen in the algorithm. I'd so appreciate it. And comment. I want to hear from you guys. Tell me your stories. You can totally disagree with me. That is perfect. That's why I do these videos, so that we can have discussions. Okay. And I will see you next time. Bye, guys.